Hello everyone, my name is Jan Langeslag. I will be delivering this talk today on online life and language testing, rethinking, test taking and preparation, with thanks to Will Bayless, Jonathan Dixon and Christopher Redmond. A quick overview here of what I will cover in today's talk. I will start by introducing IELTS VCS, which is the IELTS speaking test delivered on computer. I will then highlight potential issues that may come up with computer-delivered speaking tests. I'll present some research results real quickly, and I will close with tips on how to maximize test taker readiness for VCS. A very quick overview here of the history of IELTS. IELTS has existed under its current name since 1989. There were some revisions in the mid-90s and the early noughties, the first half of the noughties really. Most importantly, in the context of this talk here, is the introduction of IELTS on computer in 2017. It's important to keep in mind that IELTS on computer does actually not include the speaking part of the test. The speaking test online was only introduced in 2020, named VCS. IELTS on computer only deals with the writing, listening, and reading components. The speaking test was, up until 2020, still done face-to-face with a real-life examiner. Since 2020, there is the option of doing this online through VCS as well. Now, implications for test preparation have been a source of, some worry and some anxiety among test takers, but also among teachers. Not everybody is sure how this will affect their test preparation strategy. So that is actually the most important point of today's talk here. First and foremost, it's important to point out that IELTS VCS assesses exactly the same skills as IELTS face-to-face. There is the same content in terms of topics and in terms of tasks, task types, and the examiners use exactly the same rating criteria as they do in the offline delivered IELTS. So it would be fairly easy to say, well, the same test, that means we can use the same test preparation methods. And most of the time, this actually is true. But we have this talk for a reason. Now, of course, there are some possible implications here of a shift from a face-to-face real life to a computer-based mode of delivery. When the platform or the mode of delivery of a test is changed, de Beer and Visser say, in practice, it is often too easily accepted without empirical verification that a computerized version of a test will provide exactly the same results as the paper and pencil version. McDonald echoes the same view somewhat more succinctly and says, equivalence should not be assumed, but it always needs to be demonstrated. Meaning that even if we do not change the content of the test, the very fact that you change the mode of delivery can introduce some subtle changes to the construct being tested that often are not noticed and that often fly under the radar. Kiddle and Kormos in 2011 identify potential risks surrounding computer-delivered speaking tests. First of all, they mention construct underrepresentation, specifically the concern that interactional competence is insufficiently assessed in a computer-delivered mode. They also have concerns regarding authenticity, stating that a computer delivery is not authentic. They mostly here talk about semi-direct mode of delivery, which is the candidate hearing recorded input and then subsequently reporting or recording their own response. So it's not very relevant to IELTS VCS in particular. They also mention construct irrelevant variance. Now, CIV is present in every test with, regardless of mode of delivery, but it is very possible that the change to a computer delivered mode introduces its own construct irrelevant variance. Finally, there is the issue of appeal. Do test takers actually enjoy taking a computer-delivered speaking test? Do they have anxiety towards this, for example? Because that may also affect their performance, also feeding into point 3 construct irrelevant variance there. Now, the test essentially remains the exact same as the face-to-face version. So there's 3 parts of the test: question and answer on personal topics, a 2-minute short talk on a topic that is given, and a 2-way discussion on more unfamiliar issues. So in terms of interactional competence, the same skills are being targeted. The VCS test takes the shape of a real-time direct video conferencing call between a test taker in a test center and an examiner based in another location. So it's very much real-time, it's very direct, and it's definitely not an example of a semi-direct speaking test. Kim and Craig mention what matters is what attributes the media have and how they are used. Given this insight, one can assume that implementations of video conferencing that do not use attributes of the technology that are not available in the face-to-face medium will result in similar performances. So basically, the less influence technology is going to have on the proceedings, compared to the usual face-to-face medium, the less risk there is of, results being significantly affected. In the case of IELTS VCS, the interaction between the test taker and the technology are kept to a strict minimum. So when they, after they finish their usual security tests, an invigilator will lead them into an examination room with a computer where everything is set up for them. They don't actually have to spend any time switching on any systems, looking for the right programs or navigating platforms or any of that. Everything is set up and they don't really have to do much of anything themselves. This is all to make sure that the experience is as close as possible to, a face-to-face exam. Of course, that said, there are some important key differences. First and foremost, the examiner obviously isn't in the room, but appears on a screen. The test taker has to wear a headset, and also the part 2 topic appears on a screen where they just have to read it off the screen that the examiner shares with them, as opposed to actually holding a paper booklet in their hand during a face-to-face test. These can potentially lead to some issues. One of them is the hand placement. Exam takers, examinees, are instructed to leave their hands mostly on the desk in front of them, where it's obvious that they are not writing, they are not holding any cheat sheets or whatever. Very important is also that they don't make any gestures where they obscure their face and especially their mouth, because this can impact the sound quality. They have to be able to read the topic for part 2. So if they left their glasses at home, that could potentially be a problem. If they cannot see the topic clearly, it's important that they let the examiner know straight away so they can do something about it. The sound quality is, of course, another very, very important factor that could potentially, really have disruptive influence on test procedures. The invigilator sticks around during, the beginning of the test to make sure that the candidate is okay, that they can hear everything just fine. If there is a problem with the audio of any kind, it's important that they let the examiner and the invigilator know straight away, rather than mentioning it, halfway through the test. Video and audio delays lead to confusion, and they can interrupt the normal flow of a conversation. Internet connection issues, they have a lot to do with this. Usually the internet connection will be very strong, but of course it is possible in some situations that connection may be lost, and that is a potential threat, of course. All of these are only potential issues, so to see whether they actually have any real effect on real-life proceedings, we have to do ongoing validation research, both before and also after the actual test becomes operational. First and foremost, of course, is to look at scoring equivalence to see whether scores achieved on VCS and face-to-face are equivalent. You would be pleased to know that both for IELTS and also for other types of tests, there have been no significantly differences in scores have been found. But also important is that there is research into the equivalence of the cognitive processes that are engaged throughout the exam. Even if the scores are the same, if there are different, if the test taker is asked to do different things throughout the test, then it means that these scores are not assessed in the same way. And it also means that the test outcomes cannot directly be compared. So it's very important that these things are considered in research, in validation studies, as are, of course, any possible effects of computer familiarity and computer anxiety with the test takers. Let me present here real quick some findings from a study by Nakatsuhara, Inoue, Berry, and Galagzi, who, among other things, investigated language functions that were elicited on a video conferencing IELTS test and compared it to a face-to-face IELTS test. On the left side here, you see the language functions where there was a significant difference in their frequency between the two modes of delivery. We also see the count here, the number of occurrences near the middle, and then on the far right side there is the significance with, all these significance are smaller than 0.05, meaning that yes, indeed, there were significant differences observed here. We see that asking for clarification, both in part 1 and part 2, occurs more often on a video conferencing mode of the test, while comparing and suggesting happens less often, significantly less often on video conferenced IELTS. Why this happens is not exactly clear. I mean, the same test items are being used, so really there shouldn't be any difference, ideally, in the number of times certain language functions are being elicited. But yet that was the case here. It's important to keep in mind that this is just one study, right? So no matter how well the sampling has been done, that doesn't mean that this is necessarily going to be replicated across different test taker samples, but it is still an important thing to keep in mind here. Some other findings from studies, on the influence of interaction. One major one is less spontaneous body language in a computer-delivered speaking test. Even though you can see the examiner, test taker and examiner can see each other directly, body language just doesn't happen as spontaneously as in a face-to-face test. This has some repercussions, especially when an examiner is interrupting a candidate. As you may know, IELTS examiners quite often interrupt a candidate when they speak for too long or when they sort of veer off topic. Usually examiners try to use body language to sort of soften the impact of the interruption, but this doesn't come across as well in a computer-delivered speaking test, meaning that the student often misses the examiner body language and the examiner then has to slightly more brusquely interrupt a candidate. This doesn't really affect scores, but it's still a thing that occurs. There is also reports of test takers unintentionally impacting the sound quality with gestures that obscure their face and their mouth, as we discussed earlier. Now, for some recommendations as to how to best prepare test takers for VCS computer-delivered IELTS, really, as we said before, it's the same test, so the same test preparation methods hold up equally well here, but there's a couple of things to keep in mind. Very important is to ensure that test takers have practiced speaking to someone else online. Most test takers actually report higher levels of confidence and lower levels of anxiety when they are sitting the computer-delivered test because they are familiar with video conferencing technology. They know how to hold, video talks to friends or to family and so on, but make sure that this is the case. It would be maybe a bit too much of an assumption to say, okay, young people are they're digital natives, so they all are comfortable with using technology. Yes, in many cases there are, but it's not always necessarily the case. So make sure that future test takers have homework, for example. Make sure that they practice relevant task types or mock tasks on the using video conferencing technology. Also make sure that they are used to actually sitting still, relatively still, and avoid gesturing, avoid looking away from the examiner for too much. Try to maintain eye contact and certainly make sure that their face is positioned more or less in the middle of the screen throughout the speaking test. Also make sure to record and scrutinize performance and encourage candidates to do this themselves. Make sure that they look critically at what they come up with for a response and think of ways how they could expand on this, and make sure that they use all the usual language functions that are necessary, such as making comparisons, explaining opinions, and so on. Another good way to prepare for the IELTS VCS speaking test is for future candidates to book an IELTS SpeakUP session. IELTS SpeakUP is a British Council mock IELTS speaking test that is delivered online. The test taker will have a mock speaking exam over Zoom with an experienced IELTS expert, and they will receive detailed feedback on their performance and how to improve. They will not receive an actual IELTS score, so this is not really a test. It is simply a way to, see how you're doing, get to grips with what IELTS delivered on a computer is like. So it would be a really useful way for people to prepare and get ready. You'll see a link near the bottom of the screen here. Here is a short bibliography of some of the sources that I have visited. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, William Bayliss, for the question and answer session. Thank you all for listening. Bye.